So those students who have taken my classes recognize that I am a wordsmith. You know my maiden name, my birth name was Smith, and I'm a literature professor, and I write poetry, and I write short stories. So words and wordsmithing come very easy to me. The problem with what I'm going to talk to you about today is I've never had words before today, and even I don't know when I'll have the words to do it, to do my wordsmith thing, to do justice to the story that I'm about to tell. Although it is a story that certainly deserves to be told and certainly deserves to be passed on, I would have dreamed of greeting you today with a poem about it, or a short story. I tell you, if you want to read the novel about that or the piece of creative nonfiction about it, that you can find it at this address at Amazon. But as of today, even though this journey started in my life over 8 years ago, I don't have the words to bring it to fruition. So for right now, we'll start with just those words. It's a story that I need to tell, and it's a story that deserves to be passed on. So can you repeat that for me? It's a story that I need to tell, and it's a story that deserves to be passed on. So while we're having our technical difficulty, I'll talk to you a little bit about what I want to talk to you about that, and that's the idea of hazing, and how hazing, just a desire to control access, affects our very idea of how we can belong to a group. So what I've titled it has to do with the pain of belonging, the power of connection and the pain of belonging. But it's a story that I need to tell, and it's a story that deserves to be passed on. So I would like to start with a textbook definition of hazing, but because we're still experiencing technical difficulty, we're not going to be able to do it verbatim. But I'll tell you how hazing has been defined. The best place to find the hazing definitions that are at work in both our legal systems and at work in our systems where hazing takes place is found on stophazing.org. And it's a sort of a textbook definition that hazing is an activity that is designed to control, to humiliate, to cause injury to, or to force someone to do because they want to belong, whether that person is cooperative with that system or not. And we see hazing in almost every aspect of our culture. Most hazing takes place, as we are right now, on university campuses, or that's the story that you're usually told. Hazing, in fact, has been around as long as humans have been around. But hazing and the university system have grown up together. The earliest evidence of hazing is in the oldest university, probably one of the oldest, the best known universities in our country, and that's at Harvard University, where there's evidence of people having been affected by and also censured by because they were involved in hazing, and that goes back to the 1600s. Almost 55% of students at universities will be exposed to some sort of hazing. But hazing isn't all about universities, because hazing takes place in sports. Hazing takes place early on in ideas about how you belong and how you prevent access. Right now, in the early ages, we call it bullying. Hazing takes place in all these venues. It also takes place in the military. One of the things you want to recognize about hazing as our visuals come on, here's our textbook definition again. Hazing is any activity expected of someone joining a group or to maintain full status in that group that humiliates, degrades, or risks emotional and or physical harm regardless of the person's willingness to participate. I'm going to come back to that idea of being willing to participate. Most of us want to belong. Most of us want to be a part of an in-group. And it's that willingness that I want to talk to you about today. But hazing does hurt. It hurts mentally. Most people who've been hazed are impacted by some form of stress and anxiety. And many people who are hazed wind up being diagnosed with or mistreated or self-treating themselves, what would we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Hazing hurts physically. Physical violence is enacted upon people who are hazed every day. And just as we talk about people dying of diseases that have been around with us for a while, there's someone who's going to be adversely affected by hazing, even during the time of period that we're sitting here today. Hazing also affects you emotionally. And part of what I want for you to remember about that is one of the most insidious aspects of hazing that is often blamed on the very victims of hazing. There must have been something wrong with him or her, or this wouldn't have happened. But hazing actually changes your brain. It changes the brain of the hazer because of the rush of adrenaline and power you receive from being dominant over someone else. And it affects the brain of the person being hazed. The basal ganglia are overexcited. They are over anxious. They watch for the next time that the injury is going to take place. And many times, because of these changes in the brain, they self-direct themselves. They end up hazing themselves, not because of some weakness in them, but because, like you, they have a brain that's affected by the things that they're exposed to. And it also hurts spiritually because it takes you out of a sense of who you are. You forget in your quest for belonging who you used to be or who you might have been before your desire to join this group affects you. Hazing causes all kinds of things: mental illness, alcohol abuse, domestic violence, but most importantly, hazing kills. I want you to think about that as we look at the names of these people that I just tore from the headlines. Most of them I tried to keep in this decade, but I could have gone back to any decade and found this list. Most of you are familiar with what happened to Robert Champion at Florida A&M, who died as a result of hazing injuries he sustained while he was trying to join a band fraternity. Most of you aren't familiar with the other names, but all of them have died just recently as a result of hazing. I'm going to call your attention to just a few. Harry Liu was a U.S. Marine who served in Afghanistan, and he was hazed to the extent that he committed suicide as a result of what happened to him in the military, as a result of actions that took place from officers who he reported to and for people who had control over him while he was serving our country honorably. He died just this year. Most of us think of hazing as something that happens basically man to man, that it's all about masculinity. Have you ever wondered how you define what's masculine? Some people define what's masculine by the car they drive, by the power that they yield, by those who they subsume under them. Most of the time, masculinity is misdefined in these ways. But if you'll notice, there are the names of women on this board as well, who died as a result of hazing. So it can't all be about masculinity. It can't all be about power and access. Sometimes it is, most times it is, but it also has to do with what we accept, what we think that we cannot change, and what we decide that we cannot control. The headlines, as I say in the slide, tell part of the story. The 9 men indicted in the Ohio fraternity case caused the death of a person trying to join their fraternity. The parents of Robert Champion filed a lawsuit after his death. Miami University has not fully disclosed the evidence that they found against the fraternity in their midst, but they have removed this fraternity that was chartered in I think 1855 at that university. And most recently, criminal charges were brought in a Boston fraternity where young men were found duct taped in a basement, covered with beer and other things, and tied together where they had been left. And it was reported because of the noises that they heard coming from that space. And in the case of Harry Liu, the soldier who was serving honorably in Afghanistan, the Army recommended court-martialing several officers in this case, but to date, only a few of them have been sentenced to any charges. But the other thing I want to talk to you about, as I said to begin with, is that this is a story that needs to be told, and it's a story that deserves to be passed on, but I don't have the words for it. And the reason I don't is because hazing hit home in my own life. The headlines that I'm about to show you are all about my son. And I want to tell you a little bit about him because he's not here today to speak for himself. Part of the reason why I'm just speaking out about this publicly now is because I wasn't sure whose story this was. Certainly it was my son's story, but he didn't have the words to tell his own story for himself for many years. Certainly it's my story. He's my only child. I agonized before I had him as to what color I should paint the bathroom. Should I paint it blue? That seems so overdone. Maybe I'll do it yellow because that will inspire him to greater heights. I thought about the fact that it's very difficult to raise a male in this country to the age of maturity without him encountering some sort of danger. And that is exponentially made more difficult when that male is of African descent in this country. Do you know that the #1 cause of death for African American males ages 18 to 25 is a violent death? So when I raised him to the point of being 18 with a 3.9 GPA from a private university, I taught at that time at Vanderbilt University, and he attended University School of Nashville. It's the finest school in the area. I've got the bills where I paid his tuition to prove that as well. And when he got accepted at Harvard, it was a great thing. When he got accepted at Emory, it was a great thing. When he got accepted at Morehouse, at Johns Hopkins, at Duke University, at UNC, he didn't apply here. All those things were great. But he decided, because of something that had happened when he was 10 years old, that he wanted to solve the problem of HIV/AIDS. One of those things that happened along that journey was that he was taken by his mother, who was going to show him the whole world through the announcement that Magic Johnson made about HIV/AIDS. It happened when he was just a kid, and he made that announcement downtown, not too far from North Carolina State University. I wanted my son to understand that life went on after HIV/AIDS, but most importantly, that there was work to be done. He also watched a wonderful movie called Outbreak, and he decided right then and there that he was going to resolve that problem, that his life was going to be dedicated to eradicating HIV/AIDS. He decided this at the age of 10. I used to want to grow up and be just like him. So far, I'm just trying to grow up at this point, but I used to want to grow up to be just like him. So he goes off to Emory. He has a fantastic first semester, 3.9 GPA. Couldn't have asked for better. He went in with a whole semester's worth of AP credit. This was a young man who was ready to change the world, who could do that biomedical research, who could work at the CDC, who could eradicate HIV/AIDS, until he decided to pledge a fraternity. He made those decisions in the face of advice from me not to do it. You don't need that fraternity. They need you. But he remembered with joy the experiences that I had had having pledged a sorority as an adult. Having pledged, in fact, with my 65-year-old mother at that time, we were not hazed. It was a beautiful experience of sisterhood for me. But I also had taught at a university where people looked the other way when young men and women were being hazed in fraternity and sorority incidents. There's very little universities can do sometimes, because hazing is accepted as an everyday part of our society. So he decided to pledge. And the headlines tell the story, but you don't know the whole of the story. Because of the injuries he sustained, I can only show you the picture on the left, which was the evidence of the very first beating he received. He was beaten every day for a period of 8.5 weeks. I kind of got an inkling that something was wrong. We talked every day when he said, I didn't realize that you really saw stars like you do on the cartoons when you were being knocked out. I couldn't do very much with the decision, that information. I'd encouraged him to report it. You don't have to do this. Give me permission to speak on your behalf. No, don't do it, Mom, he said. I'm a grown man and I've made this decision and I want to go through with this. I can do it. I can do it. I can do it because once I join this organization, I can change the world. I have a whole idea about a community service project that we're going to undertake because all the other members of this fraternity will graduate and we'll be here and we'll be able to make a real difference. But I deliberately put his picture against the unknown African-American man who was enslaved just to see the brutality that people undergo. This is something that didn't just start in the university system. We as humans have enjoyed brutalizing each other for some time. And in fact, we expect it and we excuse it. Part of what I want to speak about today is that so many times we look the other way. So many times we know that someone's being forced to consume alcohol, and often we laugh about that. We know that people are being forced to dress in a certain way. We know that they're being sleep deprived. We know that things are happening to them that we can see, but we don't see the changes in their brains. Even as this was happening to my son, I could not have written the rest of the story, even though it's a story that deserves to be told and it's a story that needs to be passed on. I couldn't have told you when it first happened that he would be diagnosed with PTSD, that they would then change that diagnosis to something else, that they would then say that he would have been destined for this forever because bipolar disorder was in his family, ignoring completely the fact of the brutality that he went through. And I had pictures. I had pictures because his roommate, who also was pledging a fraternity at the time, a young Jewish man who suffered through forced alcohol intake and his experience, that they had formed a pact and agreed to document each other's experiences. And so there were pictures. But they had taken him on a camera that I couldn't find. I couldn't have told you when this first started that he would be hospitalized in a mental institution over and over and over again because of brain damage that he sustained did not allow the medications to work in the ways that they were supposed to do. I couldn't have expected then that medication that would be given to him to calm down his basal ganglia would actually excite him. I couldn't have explained that to you now. I still have a hard time believing it. But over a period of time, he was in the hospital over and over and over again. And that young man who was poised to save the world, who was poised to end HIV/AIDS, who was ready to dedicate his life as a 10-year-old to do something positive in the world, could not go back to school and stay. In fact, he stayed out one semester when he was just being diagnosed with depression. And when he went back, his fraternity brothers already had an underground line. I will say my son was brave because the first time he was put into the hospital, into a mental institution, one of the things he had come home to do was to have spring break. And he was seriously saying he didn't want to continue to affiliate with those people, that he in fact had told the primary hazer that he was quitting. And it was that conversation that got him drugged, that got he and a companion in a state of mind that they were both and still are being affected by. But he wrote in crayon what was happening to the young men who were then online in a 15-page document that I was able to get from the nurse because I couldn't touch my son behind the glass in the mental institution. I couldn't hug him and tell him it was going to be all right. I couldn't say, thank you for your bravery in a way that he could feel. I could just take the crayon papers and report it to the school. That's all I could do. But every day we could do something different. Every day when we know these things are happening, when it happens to your friend, it should be your story. When it happens to somebody in your dorm or somebody you know from an affiliation in another group, it can't just be his or her story about hazing. It has to be your story. We can't afford to look the other way. We can't afford to be in silence because this is a story that deserves to be told, and it's a story that we have to pass on. Just so you'll breathe a sigh of relief about my son, just last year, 8 years after this incident started, 8 years where he's had to redefine himself over and over again, he went back to Emory University last year. And so there's still a story to tell. There's still an opportunity for him to change the world, to eradicate HIV, or to be somebody completely different, because there'll be a value in the experience of finding himself after all that he's been through. So I'll leave you with these words. It's a story that I need to tell, and it's a story that we need to pass on. Thank you.